On a quiet weekday morning in a small, close-knit town, a gang of desperate criminals stormed Cole Security Bank, their weapons raised, their eyes fixed on easy money. They saw the bank's black owner, Darius Cole, as nothing more than an obstacle, a soft target in a suit, a man they believed would comply, cower, and open the vault without resistance. What they didn't see was the soldier beneath the surface. A former Navy SEAL, Darius had faced death before and conquered it. While the gang mistook his calm for weakness, he was calculating, reading their every move. As they tightened their grip, confident in their power, Darius prepared to dismantle them from the inside, because no one was taking what he had built. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. It was a calm weekday morning, the kind that made small-town life feel like a gift. Sunlight spilled over the streets, warming the red brick sidewalks and casting soft shadows across the well-worn benches lining the road. The gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze created a soothing backdrop, blending with the distant hum of a delivery truck making its early rounds. The town was just waking up, stretching into the day with a comforting familiarity. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the nearby diner, mixing with the faint aroma of warm bread from Mason's bakery. The occasional murmur of a neighborly greeting echoed through the streets. Inside Cole Security Bank, the world was even quieter, a haven of order and routine, shielded from the outside bustle. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the air, blending with the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. The polished counters gleamed under the morning sunbeams that streamed through the large front windows. Potted plants added a subtle touch of life to the otherwise formal decor. The atmosphere was one of quiet efficiency, a place where people felt their hard-earned savings were safe. Darius Cole sat in his office at the back of the bank, the door slightly ajar. His desk was neatly organized, ledgers stacked with precision, a cup of black coffee cooling beside his hand. He reviewed a quarterly financial report, eyes scanning the numbers with practiced ease. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his broad frame. His fingers traced the paper's edges, but his mind drifted beyond the neatly printed figures. The desert heat, the weight of his gear pressing into his back, that heavy silence just before a breach. The ghost of his Navy SEAL past lingered, surfacing in quiet moments like this. The instincts remained sharp, though now dulled by time and distance. That life was behind him, but its lessons, discipline, vigilance, the value of readiness, remained etched into his being. Now he was a businessman, a builder of stability in a place that valued it. People in town respected him, though not for the battles he fought overseas. They admired what he had built here, a place of security, trust, and opportunity, a future that stood firm, far from the chaos of his former life. "Morning, Mr. Cole," a cheerful voice called from the doorway. Sophie, his branch manager, leaned in, her smile brightening the room. Darius offered a slight nod. "All good? So far," she replied with a playful wink, her confidence a reflection of the smooth operations they had worked hard to achieve. In the lobby, life carried on as it always did. Mrs. Henderson sat in her usual spot, her knitting bag resting beside her feet as she exchanged pleasant words with a teller. Tom and Rachel, a young couple, leaned close together, discussing the possibilities of a home loan, hope flickering in their eyes. Ben, a teenager with wide eyes and a nervous smile, proudly held his first paycheck, his excitement palpable. Ordinary people, ordinary lives. A morning like any other, quiet, predictable, and safe, until the door burst open. Bam! The sound cut through the stillness like a gunshot, but it was the metal frame slamming against the wall. 3 men stormed in, faces masked, guns raised with cold precision. "Down! Everyone down!" a voice barked, sharp and commanding. The bank's tranquility shattered in an instant, replaced by the raw chaos of fear. Screams pierced the air, gasps of shock. Chairs scraped against the polished floor as customers scrambled for safety. People dropped to their knees, hands covering their heads, hearts racing. Carlos Reyes led the charge, his eyes predatory, his posture confident. He scanned the room swiftly, taking in every detail like a seasoned criminal. His hand rested firmly on his pistol, his gaze cutting through the cowering civilians. He was in charge, and he knew it, at least for now. Beside him, Marcus Slim Reed was less composed. He shoved Ben, the teenage boy, hard to the ground. The boy hit the floor with a grunt, clutching his paycheck as if it might shield him. Slim's eyes darted, his weapon jerking with his breathing. Fast, uneven. He was wired, volatile, the kind of man whose finger could slip at any second. Near the door, Liam Brooks stood like a sentry, though his nervous glances betrayed him. His eyes flicked between the street outside and his partner's inside, his fingers tightening and loosening on his pistol. He was jittery, more afraid than dangerous, grasping the gun more to feel strong than to use it. Darius Cole moved slowly, calm, steady. His hands rose, palms open, a gesture of surrender. But his mind worked faster than ever, assessing, calculating. His training took over. The instincts drilled into him from years of high-stakes operations. He stepped from his office into the chaos, eyes sharp as they swept across the room. Civilians trembling, faces pressed against the floor. Sophie was near the counter, her face pale but composed. Mrs. Henderson clutched her knitting bag with frail hands. Tom and Rachel huddled together, whispering prayers between ragged breaths. This was his bank. Now it was a battlefield. Darius lowered himself onto his knees, moving with careful precision. His breathing slowed, heart steady, his focus narrowing. He was outnumbered, but he had faced worse, and he would not let this stand. Darius kept his head low, but his focus sharp. Every detail mattered. The distance to the exits, the layout of the counters, the exact placement of every person in the room. The trembling clerk's hand hovered near the silent alarm beneath the desk. He saw it all, catalogued it. But this wasn't the time. His instincts urged action, but he forced them down. Civilians were the priority. Their safety came before retribution. He could wait. "Phones! Now!" Carlos barked, his voice slicing through the tense air like a whip. He waved his gun for emphasis. "Throw them here! All of them!" Hands shook as people scrambled into pockets and purses. The metallic clink of devices hitting the tile floor formed a nervous rhythm. A pile of phones grew in the center of the room. Some slipped from sweaty fingers, clattering loudly, making their owners flinch. A few buzzed faintly, calls from loved ones, perhaps sensing something was wrong. Slim stomped forward, his boot coming down hard on a ringing phone. The screen shattered with a crack, fragments skittering across the floor. He ground his heel into it, lips curled in satisfaction. "You, shut it off!" he snarled at Sophie, his weapon twitching in her direction. Her breath caught in her throat. She held back tears as she fumbled with the phone. Her fingers trembled, but she silenced it. Carlos's eyes swept over the room, but they stopped on Darius. He lingered there. There was an assessment in that gaze, sharp, calculating. He saw what Darius was trying to conceal, the calm, the steadiness. He recognized the difference. "You own this place?" Carlos asked, voice lower now, controlled, probing. Darius met his gaze and nodded slowly. "Yes." Carlos's lips twitched into a thin smirk, like he had found leverage, an anchor of power. "Good. You'll get the vault open. No alarms, no games." Darius didn't flinch. His face was steady, his voice smooth. "Understood." There was no defiance, only compliance. But Carlos was no fool. His eyes narrowed. He saw it. The restraint, the control. Men like Darius were dangerous because they didn't show fear. Then, the faint wail of sirens, distant but closing in. Police, faster than the gang had anticipated. Carlos's posture stiffened. Tension rippled through him like a snapped wire. "Cops already!" "Damn it, Liam!" Liam's face paled. He flinched, raising his hands defensively. I didn't do anything. I swear!" Slim whipped his gun toward Liam, finger tense on the trigger. his teeth bared in frustration. "You screw this up, you're dead, man!" Darius shifted. Small, deliberate. He angled himself between Slim and the nearest cluster of hostages, Mrs. Henderson and young Ben. Slim was exactly the kind of man Darius knew too well. The kind whose fear disguised itself as aggression. The kind whose finger itched for an excuse to pull the trigger. The most dangerous kind in moments like this. Carlos raised his hand, fingers splayed. An unspoken command for control. The tension between Slim and Liam simmered, but didn't boil over. Both men held their ground, though their eyes burned with suspicion. The room, already fragile, teetered on the edge. Carlos turned his focus back to Darius. His voice lowered, deliberate, cutting through the tense air like a blade. "We need that vault open. You make a move. Anyone dies. It's on you." Darius's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his skin. He met Carlos's gaze, steady and resolute. His words were clipped, measured. No moves, just the vault. It was a promise and a warning. Outside, the sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing against the brick buildings. The muffled sound of car doors slamming and boots scuffing against pavement followed. Then, a commanding female voice rose over a megaphone, firm but calm. "This is Sergeant Michelle Tanner of the City Police Department. The building is surrounded. No one needs to get hurt. Let's talk." The atmosphere inside the bank hardened like glass. Hostages clutched each other tighter, breath shallow. Sophie squeezed Mrs. Henderson's hand. Ben stared wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Slim's knuckles whitened around his gun. His pulse was visible in his neck. Carlos's face darkened, his jaw locked, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this. Not so quickly. The walls were closing in. His window of control was shrinking with every passing second. His eyes snapped back to Darius. He jerked his head toward the back. Vault. Now. There was no room for delay. No patience left. Darius pushed to his feet, slow and deliberate. Every movement calculated. His eyes flicked to the hostages one last time. Darius stood, careful with every motion. He led Carlos and Slim toward the rear of the bank. His body shielded them from the other hostages, but his eyes remained vigilant, noting the gang's chemistry, or lack of it. Carlos was a strategist, but tense. Slim was a powder keg. Liam was terrified. As they reached the vault, the air between Darius and Carlos tightened. The others were out of earshot, but the weight of the situation pressed down like a vice. Carlos leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. "You're calm. Too calm. You're not stupid. I see that, but don't mistake this for a game. One wrong move, and I'll blow someone's head off. Understand?" Darius held his gaze, unflinching. His eyes were steady, his face unreadable. Understood. There was no challenge in his tone, only certainty. A promise to comply, but also a message. He was not afraid. He turned to the vault, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Each turn of the dial was deliberate. He listened, not to Carlos breathing behind him or Slim shifting impatiently, but to the subtle clicks within the lock, the familiar rhythm, the gentle resistance as the final number fell into place. Click, click, click. The heavy door groaned open, revealing the neatly stacked bundles of cash. Rows of crisp bills, arranged with almost surgical order. Slim let out a low, satisfied grunt, his excitement barely contained. His fingers twitched, eager to grab what he came for. But Carlos's eyes stayed sharp. He wasn't celebrating. His mind was already racing past the money. He knew the hardest part wasn't getting in. It was getting out. Darius saw it. He caught a glimpse toward the front, through the glass doors. Sergeant Tanner's silhouette stood firm outside, flanked by officers. Her posture spoke of patience, but Darius knew better. The net was tightening. His attention shifted back to Carlos. The leader's eyes had changed. That sliver of control was cracking, giving way to something more dangerous, desperation. And desperate men made mistakes. The vault door creaked fully open, revealing neatly stacked bundles of cash wrapped in crisp paper bands. The sight was almost ceremonial, the culmination of Carlos's plan. But instead of satisfaction, his jaw tightened. It was the same tension Darius had seen on soldiers in enemy territory, the brief high of progress before reality crashed down. They were still trapped inside the bank. Surrounded, Carlos's breathing slowed, controlled, but his eyes flicked toward the front windows. The police perimeter was tightening, flashes of movement from officers positioning behind vehicles, rifles slung low but ready. A megaphone crackled again, Sergeant Michelle Tanner's voice firm but patient as she urged cooperation. Her tone was measured, but Darius knew what was behind it. A clock ticking, a situation sliding toward disaster. Slim let out a low whistle, eyes hungry as he scanned the vault's contents. "This is it, man. This is it," he muttered, half to himself, half in awe, but his hand still gripped his rifle like he was expecting ghosts to burst from the walls. Carlos didn't respond. He was calculating. Darius remained silent, standing just outside the vault as the gang began hastily stuffing duffel bags. He kept his movements non-threatening, his posture slightly slouched, not out of fear, but to present himself as harmless, unimportant, invisible. Yet, his gaze catalogued everything, their urgency, their fear, and, most importantly, their fraying control. Behind them, the hostages huddled together on the floor, some clutching hands, others crying softly. Mrs. Henderson's lips moved in prayer, while Ben avoided looking at Slim's gun altogether. Darius's heart clenched at the sight, but he didn't let it show. His body remained still. His mind, anything but. Suddenly, Liam shifted near the door, casting a nervous glance outside. His knuckles were white around his weapon, but he wasn't standing with the confidence of a man committed to violence. He was standing like someone who wanted out. That was an opening. "You know they'll give you a deal." Darius spoke lowly, voice careful, aimed only at Liam, not the others. "You get out now. You could walk away." Liam flinched, but his eyes shot to Carlos, fearful. "Shut up," he hissed, though his voice cracked. Carlos noticed the exchange. His head snapped toward Darius, eyes narrowing like a predator catching the scent of weakness. "Talk to him again, and I'll put a hole in you." Darius held his gaze, unwavering but neutral. He didn't need to speak further. The seed was planted. Slim stomped back toward the hostages, his agitation growing. "Cops are out there, just waiting to light us up. We need leverage." His voice cracked with frustration, and he grabbed Rachel, the young woman from the couple, pulling her to her feet. She screamed, and Tom lunged instinctively, only for Slim to jam his rifle into the man's chest, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Darius's muscles coiled, but he stayed still. The urge to act surged through him like a flood. But it wasn't the time. Not yet. "Back off, Slim!" Carlos barked, moving between them. He shoved Slim's weapon down, his authority cutting through the chaos. But Darius saw the flicker of doubt in Carlos's eyes. Not doubt in his power, but doubt in his own men. Slim was slipping beyond control. Liam was cracking. The plan was fraying, and Carlos knew it. "We need a way out," Carlos muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His eyes swept over the hostages, then landed on Darius again. "Cops know you. You're the bank owner. They trust you." Darius felt it coming before Carlos spoke it aloud. "You're our guarantee. You walk us out, we'll put a gun to your back." They won't risk shooting their local hero. Darius's stomach twisted, but outwardly he gave nothing away. Instead, he nodded slowly, making it seem like compliance was his only option. "If it keeps everyone else safe, I'll do it," he said, his tone firm but measured. Carlos studied him, his eyes narrowing as though trying to see through the calm facade. He didn't trust Darius, but he recognized the utility. Slim, however, scowled. He wanted blood. Cooperation wasn't in his vocabulary. "Good," Carlos muttered, giving Slim a look that brooked no argument. We move when I say. You step wrong, you die first. Darius locked eyes with him. I understand. The room held its breath. Outside, the megaphone crackled again. Sergeant Tanner's voice, more urgent now. We need proof that everyone is okay. Show us the hostages. Carlos motioned to Slim, who yanked Mrs. Henderson to her feet and dragged her toward the window. She raised shaking hands, signaling to the officers outside. Darius saw it. The officers stiffened behind their cover. They were ready. One wrong twitch, and bullets would tear through the glass. Carlos lowered his voice to Darius, his tone deadly. You're our key out of this. You die. They die. You understand me? Darius met his gaze without flinching. I understand perfectly. But Carlos didn't see what was behind those eyes, the silent calculation of a man who had faced death before and come out standing. The battle hadn't started yet, but Darius was already positioning for victory. The tension inside Cole Security Bank had settled into a suffocating fog. The deal was set. Carlos Reyes made it clear. Darius was their key out. He would walk them through the police line, guns at his back, ensuring no officer risked a shot. Sergeant Michelle Tanner, the negotiator outside, had relented, her voice over the megaphone strained but resigned. We'll let you leave with the bank owner. No sudden movements, no weapons raised. We need him alive, she had said. Her tone was firm, but Darius could hear what was underneath. It wasn't victory. It was desperation. The police were handcuffed. If Darius walked out as their shield, the gang had the upper hand. But none of that mattered now, because inside, the temperature was rising. Slim Reed's agitation had become a visible tremor. He paced near the hostages, the barrel of his rifle dipping dangerously close to people's heads. His face was flushed, breathing rapid. This wasn't adrenaline anymore. It was something worse. It was a man slipping into that space where violence felt like control. Carlos knew it too. He watched Slim from the corner of his eye, calculating, but he wasn't moving to stop him. Not yet, because Carlos needed Slim. And that was the problem. When men like Slim held value, everyone was in danger. Darius remained still, near the vault, his eyes sweeping the room, reading it like a battlefield. The hostages were wilting under the pressure. Mrs. Henderson was praying under her breath, while young Ben was holding back tears. Tom and Rachel clutched hands so tightly their knuckles were white. And that was when it happened. A burst of movement. A hostage bolting toward the rear door. A man in his 50s, his face drenched in sweat. Panic overtaking reason. Don't! Darius started. But the words barely left his mouth before Slim spun, his rifle snapping up. Bang! The gunshot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Not at the man, into the air, but the intent was clear. Screams erupted from the hostages. The runner stumbled and collapsed to the floor, sobbing, convinced he was dead. Slim barked over the chaos. You think this is a joke? You think I won't drop you? His voice cracked. Part rage, part exhilaration. Carlos surged forward, grabbing Slim's arm. Enough! We need him alive! But Slim wrenched free, turning toward the others, eyes wide, bloodshot. You don't get it, man. They think we're weak. That's why they're running. He raised the rifle again, aiming this time, not into the air. Darius moved. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise. The kind of movement that came from a man who had been trained to step into the fire. He placed himself between Slim's gun and the hostages. Slim! Darius's voice was low, steady, but with an edge of steel beneath it. You fire that gun again. This ends with all of us dead. You know that. Slim's hand shook, rage and doubt battling in his eyes. Don't talk to me like you know me, old man. I know you better than you think. Darius's eyes didn't waver. I know you don't want to die here. Not today. Not like this. Carlos watched the exchange closely. He had seen something. The way Darius moved. The precision. The lack of fear. This wasn't a banker playing hero. This was a man who had faced worse. and walked out breathing. Carlos spoke, his voice low but carrying authority. "Slim, stand down." For a moment, Slim hesitated, but then he cursed under his breath and backed off, the barrel of his rifle dipping. The crisis had passed, barely, but Carlos's eyes didn't leave Darius. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Darius didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the man who had tried to run, still breathing, clutching his chest, tears running down his face. The others were huddled, eyes wide with fear. This was his reason for holding back. Every second he stayed alive, every second he kept Carlos and Slim focused on him, was a second that kept these people breathing. Finally, Darius spoke, quiet, but resolute. "I've been in situations. I know how this works." Carlos's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else. "Respect. That's why you're walking us out." Carlos's voice lowered, as though sealing the arrangement again. "You're not a shield. You're insurance." Darius gave a subtle nod, but inside, he knew the dynamic had shifted. Carlos didn't see him as leverage anymore. He saw him as a threat. That would make Darius's eventual move harder, but also clearer, because now he knew that walking out of this bank wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The countdown to his abduction had started, and Darius was ready. The tension in the bank was so thick it clung to the air like smoke. Carlos Reyes barked final orders as he hoisted one of the cash-stuffed duffel bags over his shoulder, his movements quick, efficient, but edged with impatience. The police outside had agreed to the demand. Darius Cole would walk them out as their shield, their guarantee of safe passage. The hostages stayed huddled against the floor, eyes wide with fear. Amos and Henderson clutched Sophie's hand, while young Ben pressed his face into his knees, flinching at every sudden movement. Darius met their eyes briefly before rising. He gave them nothing overt, but the calm in his face was deliberate, a silent promise that this wasn't over. "Move," Carlos muttered, pushing him forward with a firm hand between his shoulder blades. Slim Reed stayed close on Darius's left, his rifle raised just below his chest, low enough to look non-threatening to police, high enough to shoot him through the ribs at the first misstep. Liam Brooks trailed behind, clutching his pistol like it might break apart in his hands. His face was pale, eyes darting like he was already picturing the worst. The glass doors opened with a faint chime, mockingly ordinary. Sunlight washed over them, but there was no warmth. Outside, the police line stretched tight. Patrol cars parked at angles, doors open, officers crouched behind them, rifles aimed but steady, faces tense, fingers near triggers. The voice of Sergeant Michelle Tanner came through the megaphone again, calm but stretched. "We see the bank owner. Everyone stay calm." Darius led the way, his hands raised to shoulder height. Carlos's gun pressed subtly into his lower back, a constant reminder. Slim kept his weapon angled low, eyes shifting from officer to officer, jaw clenched. Liam hung back, barely breathing. The distance to the van was barely 20 steps, but it felt like crossing a minefield. Each step was calculated, not just for survival, but for what came next. Darius knew what this was now. He wasn't just a hostage, he was a loose end. If he went into that van, the odds of returning were slim, but he didn't fight it. Not yet. When they reached the van, Carlos slid the side door open with a swift yank. "Get in," he hissed under his breath. Darius climbed in first, deliberately slow. Slim followed, keeping his rifle trained on him, his eyes burning with suspicion and something worse. Resentment, hatred. Carlos joined next, tossing the bag of cash onto the seat beside him, his eyes flicking toward the police one last time. Liam slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life. The doors slammed shut, and just like that, the walls closed in. The outside world, the sirens, the officers, the sunlit streets, faded into muffled noise. Inside the van was different, cramped, dark. The air was thick with sweat, gun oil, and tension. The robbery was over. But this was captivity. Carlos let out a slow exhale, the adrenaline in his veins mixing with triumph. He allowed himself a smirk, turning to Darius like a man who believed he had already won. "You did good, real good," Carlos said, his voice low but cocky. "Smooth as hell out there. Cops didn't know what hit 'em." Darius didn't respond. He was too busy cataloging. Weapons. Carlos had a Glock tucked under his waistband. Slim had the assault rifle, and Liam had a cheap revolver on the seat beside him. Behavior. Carlos was confident, but slightly relaxed. Slim was still wired. His finger rested too close to the trigger. Liam. He was unraveling. Liam checked the rearview mirror 3 times within the first minute, his eyes darting at imaginary threats. They're not following, right?" Liam's voice cracked. Carlos's smirk widened. "They can't. We've got their damn golden boy back here." Slim shifted beside Darius, his eyes never leaving him. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscle twitched beneath his cheek. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he muttered, voice low enough so only Darius could hear. "You walking around back there, talking calm, like you're one of us, but you ain't. You're dead. You know that, right?" Darius met his gaze without flinching. "You said it. I'm not one of you." Slim's knuckles tightened on the grip of his rifle. Carlos interrupted before the tension boiled over. "Enough, Slim. We're almost clear." But Darius heard what was left unsaid. Almost clear. Not there yet. Because Carlos knew the same thing Darius did. This wasn't over. The roads shifted from smooth pavement to rougher outskirts. Industrial warehouses and empty lots. They were going somewhere isolated, somewhere police wouldn't stumble across. Darius leaned back against the cold metal wall of the van. He flexed his fingers subtly, testing his wrists, his range of movement. He would have one chance. One moment. His heart stayed steady. The calm before the strike, because Darius Cole wasn't a victim. He never had been. And this gang had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The van rumbled to a halt, tires grinding over gravel as it came to rest beside a rusted metal warehouse on the outskirts of town. The windows were clouded with grime, and the roof sagged under the weight of years without care. This was a place where deals soured, bodies vanished, and questions never followed. Carlos Reyes swung the van door open, stepping out into the fading light. He inhaled deeply, the weight of the money, their so-called victory, finally settling on his chest. For the first time since they stormed the bank, he allowed himself a grin. "We did it," he exhaled, more to himself than anyone else. "We actually pulled it off." Slim Reed clambered out next, his rifle still clutched like a lifeline. His eyes swept the area for threats that weren't there, because he needed someone to fear him, even in an empty place. Liam Brooks moved slower, his hand trembling as he shut the driver's door. His face had paled during the drive. Now, the adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving behind the cold, creeping dread of reality. Darius Cole was pulled from the van last. His wrists were zip-tied, and Slim gave him an extra shove, making him stumble forward onto the gravel. Darius caught himself, his jaw tight, but his eyes steady. He scanned the warehouse's surroundings, dilapidated fencing, weeds pushing through cracks, and only one visible road leading back to town. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a place designed to be forgotten. Inside, the warehouse was hollowed out. A cavernous space filled with rusted shelves, broken pallets, and the scent of oil and mildew. Light seeped through cracks in the sheet metal, casting jagged shadows across the floor. It was perfect for men planning not to leave witnesses. Carlos dropped the duffel bags onto an old workbench, the cash spilling slightly from one, crisp stacks catching the dim light. "Look at it," he said, voice tinged with pride. "All that risk, all that noise, and now we're made." Slim laughed, sharp and bitter. "Feels good, don't it?" He turned toward Darius, eyes narrowing. "Not for you, though, huh?" He stepped forward, crouching slightly, his face inches from Darius's. "You thought you were gonna walk away clean. Be the hero. Nah, you're done. And I'm gonna enjoy it." Darius didn't blink. He let Slim talk, let him feel powerful, because that kind of man thrived on seeing fear. Darius knew better than to give it to him, but Liam broke the rhythm. We don't need to kill him, do we?" His voice cracked, and all eyes turned to him. Carlos's head lifted slowly. "What did you just say?" Liam's fingers twitched. He avoided eye contact, staring instead at the cash. "I'm just saying, we got what we wanted. We're clear. Why risk more blood? He did what we asked. The cops got what they wanted. They let us walk. Maybe we just let him go. No more heat." Slim scoffed, his laugh dripping with disdain. "You serious? You think he's not gonna run straight to the cops the second we let him loose?" Carlos's smirk had faded. His eyes locked on Liam, not angry, calculating. "You scared, Liam?" Liam flinched. No, I just—" Carlos stepped forward. "We don't let people walk, Liam. You know that. You knew that when you signed up." But Darius saw the shift, the ripple beneath Carlos's words. There was uncertainty there. Not about Liam, about something bigger. Darius pressed. "You think the cartel's just gonna take their cut and walk away?" His voice was low, casual, but it sliced through the conversation like a blade. Carlos's eyes snapped to him. "What the hell are you talking about?" Darius leaned back slightly against the wall, his zip-tied wrists resting on his lap. You owe them. This was their money, right? You pay them off, and you think it's done? You know better. They'll want more, always do. That's how they keep you under their thumb." Slim sneered, but his eyes flicked toward Carlos, uncertainty creeping in. "Shut up." Darius didn't stop. He had them now. "They let you run this job, but now they know you can get money like this. Next time, they don't ask. They tell. And if you say no, you're not walking away." Carlos's jaw tightened, because it was the truth, and Darius knew it. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Darius shrugged. "I know the game. I've seen bigger men than you get chewed up and spat out. You think this cash makes you free? No, this cash is the leash." The room went still. Even Slim's breathing slowed, his fingers twitching near his trigger, but his eyes darting between Carlos and Darius. Liam swallowed hard. "So, what are we gonna do?" Carlos didn't answer. Slim snapped. "You talk too much." He lunged forward, rifle swinging like a club. The butt crashed into Darius's side, driving him into the floor. Pain burst across his ribs, but he bit back any sound. He wouldn't give them that. "You don't know a damn thing about us." Slim spat, standing over him. Carlos watched. He didn't stop it, but he didn't encourage it either. That was worse. Carlos was starting to consider the truth, and Darius knew. He had his hooks in now. The gang had their money, but their unity was bleeding out on the floor. And Darius would keep cutting until it collapsed completely. The blow to his ribs still burned, but Darius Cole masked the pain as he propped himself up against the cold metal wall of the warehouse. His breathing was measured, his face expressionless, a skill carved into him through years of military discipline. His posture was designed to convey weakness to men like Slim Reed, but it was far from submission. He was watching, calculating, waiting for the next crack to show. The earlier rush, the euphoria from escaping the bank, had bled out of the gang. The weight of the situation was settling on their shoulders now, pressing hard. That money stacked on the workbench didn't look like freedom anymore. It looked like a curse. Carlos Reyes stood a few feet away, smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. His face was still, but Darius could see the tension creeping into his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. The doubt was eating at him. Darius's words about the cartel had done their work. Liam Brooks sat on a wooden crate near the side door, elbows on his knees, head hanging low. The young man's leg bounced anxiously, his foot tapping a rapid, uneven rhythm against the concrete floor. His nerves were fraying with every minute. Slim paced like a caged animal, gripping his rifle in both hands as though the weapon was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Every few steps, his eyes snapped toward Darius, his face twisted with suspicion. "He's stallin'," Slim muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's sittin' there, playin' all calm, trying to get in our heads. That's what he's doin'." Carlos exhaled a stream of smoke, his eyes narrowing slightly, but not turning toward Slim. "No one's stalling. We got the money. We're figuring out the next step." Slim's voice sharpened. "Next step's putting a bullet in him and getting the hell out of here." Darius watched Carlos carefully. There was no immediate agreement. That hesitation, that brief pause before Carlos spoke, was everything. "We'll deal with him when we need to," Carlos said, his tone level but forced. Slim's pacing grew more aggressive. "You're letting him talk. Planting ideas in your head. You hear what he said back there? About the cartel? He's messing with you, trying to spook you." Carlos turned slightly, his eyes cold. "You think I'm scared, Slim?" The challenge in his tone made Slim hesitate, but the damage was already done. Darius could see the dynamic shifting, the delicate balance cracking. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two. His legs stopped bouncing, and after a long pause he glanced at Darius, lowering his voice so the others couldn't hear. "I didn't sign up for this," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "This was supposed to be quick. No one dead, just money. Now they're talking about killing you like it's nothing. I don't know if I can do this." Darius leaned slightly toward him, his voice low, firm. "You don't have to." Liam swallowed hard, his fingers twitching on his knees. "If I try to back out now, they'll kill me too." Darius's gaze locked onto his. "You still have a choice, but not for long." Liam's eyes darted back toward Carlos and Slim, his chest rising and falling faster. He wanted out. Darius could see it, but fear held him in place. That fear, however, could be turned. "You're not like them," Darius whispered. "You know it. I know it. But when it all goes bad, they won't hesitate to put you down to save themselves. You see that, right?" Liam's lips pressed together, his eyes wet with desperation. "I didn't want this." Before Darius could respond, Slim's voice cut through the warehouse like a whip. "What the hell are you two whispering about?" Slim's boots stomped toward them, his rifle now raised slightly, not aiming, but closer than it needed to be. Darius kept his posture relaxed, eyes steady. "He was asking if you were always this paranoid." Slim's face darkened, his knuckles whitening around his weapon. Carlos stepped between them. "Back off, Slim." The words were calm, but the weight behind them was heavier now. Slim froze. For a moment, Darius thought he might actually challenge Carlos. The air between them was tight, years of unspoken power struggles boiling to the surface. Carlos didn't blink. "I said, back off." After a long pause, Slim lowered his rifle. Barely. But his eyes burned into Darius. "You're dead," Slim muttered. "Soon as he gives the word, you're done." Carlos didn't refute it, but he didn't confirm it either. The celebration from earlier was gone. The tension was no longer just between the gang and Darius, it was within the gang itself. Carlos was doubting Slim's judgment. Slim was questioning Carlos's authority. Liam was unraveling, and Darius had cracked open every fault line. He leaned his head back against the cold metal wall, his body aching but his mind sharp. He didn't need to run. They were going to destroy themselves. All he had to do was push a little harder. The air inside the warehouse thickened with tension that pressed down on every breath. The earlier hostility had not settled. It had congealed into something more dangerous. Slim Reed's pacing had turned into full-blown prowling, his rifle hugged to his chest like a lifeline, his eyes flicking between Carlos Reyes and Darius Cole like a predator weighing which threat to pounce on first. The dim shafts of light cutting through the warehouse walls cast jagged shadows, slicing across Carlos's face, making the lines of his exhaustion and growing panic more pronounced. His bravado was thinning. The weight of the money, the cartel, and the unraveling of his crew was beginning to crush him. Liam Brooks sat near the door, his head lowered, his fingers shaking as he peeled at the corner of a cigarette box with his thumbnail. His earlier whisper to Darius, his desperate admission, lingered in the air like an open wound. He was still here physically, but mentally, he was drifting toward surrender. Outside, subtle noises cut through the quiet. Distant sounds of engines and movement. It was faint, but Darius heard it. Police. They were closing in, not charging in like cavalry, but positioning, waiting, tightening the noose. Slim heard it too. "They're out there," Slim muttered, his voice strained, his grip tightening around his rifle. "They found us, man. I knew it. Knew this was a setup." Carlos snapped his head up, eyes narrowing. "Shut up, Slim. You don't know that." Slim wasn't listening. He turned toward Darius, his face flushed, his eyes twitching with rage and fear, merging into something volatile. "He's the one. He's been playing us from the start. He's the reason they found us." Darius stayed still, his back against the cold wall, his breathing steady, but inside, his body coiled. This was it. Slim's rifle came up, barrel aimed square at Darius's chest. "I'm done with this. We end him right now." Carlos surged forward, grabbing Slim's rifle barrel with both hands, pushing it upward toward the warehouse ceiling. Slim resisted, teeth gritted, veins bulging from his neck. The struggle was brief but violent. Two men grappling for control, the sound of scuffling boots and heavy breathing echoing through the empty space. Darius shifted subtly, his eyes on the weapon. If Carlos lost control for even a second, Darius knew his window had come. He braced himself. The calm, lethal readiness of a man who had lived in the space between life and death before. But Carlos shoved Slim back, hard, sending the younger man stumbling into a pile of rusted metal sheets. The noise clanged through the warehouse like an alarm bell. Carlos's voice was sharp, cracking with strain. "I said, stand down!" Slim's chest heaved. His face twisted with humiliation and fury. "You're soft. He's playing you, and you're letting him." Carlos's hand hovered near his gun, his face hard. "I'm not going to tell you again." Darius's eyes flicked between them, two men on the verge of turning their weapons on each other. But Slim wasn't ready to cross that line. Not yet. With a guttural curse, he lowered his rifle, kicking over an old crate in frustration before retreating toward the back of the warehouse. His breathing was ragged, his eyes still wild. But Darius knew it now. Slim was past the point of reason. Next time, Carlos might not be able to stop him. Carlos turned to Darius, his chest still rising fast. "You move like that again, like you're getting ready. You die," Carlos hissed, his voice low but shaking. He had seen Darius tense, seen the readiness beneath the surface. Darius didn't deny it. He didn't need to. He just held Carlos's gaze, letting the silence speak for itself. Carlos exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. The cracks were showing, wider than before, and Darius pressed on it. "You can't control him," Darius said quietly, his tone free of taunts. "Just observation." Carlos froze. "You know it. Slim's not built for this. He's scared. He's gonna get you killed." Carlos's eyes flared, but he didn't deny it. "He's been with me a long time. That's not the same as loyalty," Darius said evenly. "When the cartel comes knocking, or when the cops make their move, Slim won't stand with you. He'll run, or he'll turn. You already see it." Carlos's fingers twitched. "You don't know him." Darius leaned slightly forward, his voice like steel. "I know men like him, and I know what happens when you let fear take the lead. He'll break. When he does, you'll die before you can draw." The words hung in the air like a knife between them. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together like he was praying. He heard every word. Carlos said nothing. He turned away, but Darius saw the doubt sinking deeper into his eyes. Outside, the distant hum of vehicles shifted again, closer, more deliberate. The police were moving, and Darius knew. His time was coming. The gang was unraveling. Violence was inevitable. He just had to survive it. The stale air inside the warehouse grew heavier with every passing second, suffocating the fragile hold Carlos Reyes had over his crew. The earlier near execution of Darius Cole had not reset the balance of power. It had shattered it further. Now, every glance, every shift in position carried an undercurrent of violence. There was no more trust. There was only waiting for someone to break. Liam Brooks, sitting nearest to the side door, looked the closest to snapping. His fingers tapped anxiously against his knee. His wounded leg stretched out before him, wrapped clumsily in a strip of cloth that did little to stop the bleeding. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his complexion pale, his eyes distant. He flinched at every creak of the warehouse walls, his ears tuned to phantom sounds, police, cartel, or perhaps his own guilt closing in on him. Carlos stood near the cash-stuffed duffel bags, his arms crossed, cigarette burning low between his fingers. Though he had stopped smoking it minutes ago, his jaw twitched occasionally, and his eyes bore into the concrete floor. He had made it out of the bank with the money, but the path forward was growing darker. The cartel's shadow loomed over his mind now, intertwining with the tension within his own crew. He was leading men who were no longer following. He was giving orders to men who had already decided they might not listen. Slim Reed, however, was still moving, still pacing. His boots scuffed over the dirt-covered floor, his assault rifle cradled in his arms, but his grip was too tight. Knuckles pale, fingers twitching near the trigger. He had been humiliated when Carlos had stopped him from killing Darius earlier, and his rage had not settled. It had boiled into paranoia. "He's sitting there, watching us, like he's waiting for something," Slim muttered under his breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear. His eyes never left Darius, who remained seated against the far wall, hands still bound in front of him. Darius's face was a mask of control, his breaths even, his eyes calm. But the stillness only enraged Slim further. No one responded to Slim's muttering. That silence, that lack of agreement from Carlos, only made Slim more dangerous. Liam shifted suddenly, his head jerking toward the door. His breathing quickened, his leg twitching as though his body had decided before his mind could catch up. I need air," Liam stammered, his voice dry and trembling. "Just a minute. I'll check outside. Make sure we're not boxed in." The words were forced, unconvincing. Darius knew it. Carlos knew it. And Slim knew it best. Slim's rifle snapped upward before Liam's hand even touched the door handle. "You don't go nowhere," Slim barked, his voice cracking. His weapon remained steady, though his face was anything but. I'm not running," Liam pleaded, his hands raised slightly, palms out. "I swear, The sound of the gunshot cracked like a whip, deafening within the metal walls. The blast echoed, mixing with Liam's scream as he collapsed against the door. His leg kicked out, blood seeping into his jeans where the bullet had grazed him. He writhed, clutching his thigh, his breathing ragged, eyes wide with shock and pain. "You goddamn idiot!" Carlos roared, his cigarette dropping from his fingers as he lunged at Slim, pushing the rifle barrel aside. "We're surrounded, you hear that? You think they didn't hear that?" Slim shoved Carlos back, his face flushed red, his lips curling in a snarl. He was gonna run. "You want cops bustin' in here, or you want him bringing 'em right to us? You gettin' soft, Carlos?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Carlos's hand hovered near his waistband where his pistol rested, but he didn't draw it. His breathing was heavy, his composure hanging by a thread. Darius saw it. The doubt, the exhaustion. Carlos was losing control of the situation, but more importantly, he was losing control of himself. In the chaos, Darius moved, not fast, not aggressive, but with purpose. He pushed off the ground, bringing his bound hands up, his focus locked on Slim's rifle. His body tensed, years of training sharpening his muscles into instinct. He stepped into Slim's side, his forearm driving against the weapon, knocking the barrel toward the floor. Slim grunted, his grip slipping for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Darius seized the stock of the rifle with both hands, twisting with practiced precision. Slim stumbled, the weapon wrenching from his grasp momentarily. Carlos shouted something, but the words were drowned beneath the thunder in Darius's ears. Slim recovered quickly, throwing an elbow backward, catching Darius in the ribs. The same bruised spot from earlier. Pain jolted through Darius's side, but he held on. He had the weapon. He was almost the muzzle of Carlos's pistol pressed against the side of Darius's head. "Drop it!" Carlos said, his voice low but quivering with rage. Darius froze, his breathing sharp, his eyes darting to Slim, who was panting, his fists clenched, face flushed with humiliation. The rifle was still partially in Darius's grasp, but the barrel against his temple changed everything. Slowly, deliberately, Darius released his grip and stepped back. Slim snatched the rifle back, his chest heaving, but he did not raise it immediately. His hand shook, and his eyes darted between Carlos and Darius. Carlos didn't lower his pistol. "Sit down," he hissed through gritted teeth. Darius met his gaze, his heart still racing, but his face betrayed none of it. He lowered himself back against the wall, hands resting in front of him, the zip ties biting into his skin. He had tested the line, and he had come close, but the moment wasn't right. Not yet. Liam groaned on the ground, clutching his leg, his whimpers filling the uneasy silence. Carlos's eyes flicked toward the door, the faint sounds of vehicles moving outside, reaching all of them now. The police were here. The noose was tightening. Inside the warehouse, the gang had ceased being a unit. They were three desperate men, each seeing an enemy in the other. And Darius knew the next explosion would not be a scuffle. It would be the end. The gunshot from earlier had left a ringing hum in the warehouse, but the silence that followed was louder than any noise. The thin veil holding these men together had torn beyond repair. Every movement now felt deliberate, every breath measured. Darius Cole shifted slightly against the cold wall, his ribs throbbing with each inhale, but he kept his face still. Pain was secondary. Control was what mattered. Slim Reed hovered near the workbench, eyes narrowed, fingers wrapped around his rifle like it was his lifeline. He was no longer masking his disdain. It bled from his every gesture. His jaw twitched as he stared at Darius, but his gaze flicked often toward Carlos Reyes, as though reassessing his place in the hierarchy. The rifle wasn't just for defense anymore. It was a statement. Carlos, however, had drifted away from the men physically, but more importantly, he had begun drifting mentally. He stood with his back partially to them, near the bags of cash, shoulders slumped forward ever so slightly, the cigarette from earlier long extinguished, his lips pressed into a tight line. The weight of the money was no longer giving him pride, it was suffocating him. His cartel contacts were silent. That silence had become an omen. Every second they didn't call back was a reminder that his life might already be forfeit. Near the door, Liam Brooks lay partially propped against the wall, his leg wrapped in a crude cloth binding, stained dark with blood. His breathing had grown labored, shallow gasps escaping his lips every few moments. The pain had drained what little resistance he had left, reducing him to a trembling, desperate figure, clinging to hope that the men around him would find some semblance of humanity before it was too late. Darius watched them all, not as victims or threats, but as pieces on a board. He had served with men who had fallen apart under pressure. He had also led those who held fast. He knew which category these men belonged to. They were surviving, but surviving wasn't living. Surviving was biting and clawing, taking the quickest way out. Surviving turned men into animals. They were already there. He just had to give the final push. The push arrived when Liam coughed, his voice cracking into a choked sob. "I need help. Please, Carlos. I'm not gonna make it." Carlos flinched. It was a subtle reaction, but Darius caught it. Weakness had entered the room again. Slim noticed it too. "He's dead weight," Slim snapped, his voice sharp and biting. "You want to carry him when we move, or you want to cut him loose and make sure he don't talk?" Liam's hand shot up defensively, though it was trembling so hard it barely held in the air. "No, no. Please, I'm not a problem. I'll do anything. I got a kid. Please, Carlos, don't let him—" His pleading voice cracked on the last word, choking on the mixture of pain and terror. Carlos's eyes flicked toward the door, calculating, though his hand twitched toward his pistol. He was weighing the cost. He was trying to see past this moment. But there was no clarity anymore, just fear. Darius leaned forward, seizing the moment. His voice was low, but the steel beneath it left no room for doubt. "You kill him. And that's another body on you when the cartel comes asking. You think they'll like hearing you wasted 2 men and brought back 1 hostage instead of their cut?" Carlos's eyes met Darius's. There was recognition there. The words carried truth. But more importantly, they offered control. Slim, however, bristled, his knuckles tightening as he stepped forward. "You keep running your mouth like you're calling shots," Slim hissed, his tone trembling with rage. "You ain't running nothing. You're dead the second he gives the word." Darius didn't look at him. He kept his focus on Carlos because he knew who mattered. Slim was noise. Carlos was the decision-maker. The one holding the string, holding all of them above the pit. Carlos inhaled sharply through his nose, his face hardening, but his voice betrayed the cracks beneath it. "We're not killing anyone right now." Slim's face twisted in disbelief. "We need to. He's gonna—" Carlos's hand shot out, shoving Slim's shoulder with force. "Enough!" Slim staggered back slightly. But it wasn't the shove that wounded him. It was the public dismissal. It stripped him of power. His face darkened, his body coiling as though ready to retaliate. He stepped forward, his rifle raising slightly, not aiming, but asserting dominance. Carlos's pistol was in his hand before Darius even registered the motion. There was no hesitation this time. The shot thundered through the warehouse. Slim jerked backward, eyes wide in shock. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He clutched his chest as his knees buckled, collapsing against the workbench. Blood spread across his shirt, soaking into the bundles of cash beside him. Carlos held his pistol steady, his chest heaving, but his expression was already shifting, part relief, part horror. He had done what was necessary, but the finality of it struck him harder than he anticipated. Liam whimpered against the door. His hands covered his ears, his eyes squeezed shut, as though trying to block out what he had just witnessed. Darius stood slowly. His hands were still bound, but his posture was different now. He was not a hostage rising from the ground. He was a man reclaiming his ground. Carlos met his gaze, his grip on the pistol loosening, but he made no move to threaten Darius. He didn't need to. He knew what Darius was now. He had seen it in his eyes all along. "You're not walking out of here without me," Darius said, his voice measured but resolute. "And you know it." Carlos didn't argue. He just lowered his gun. The power had shifted. Slim was gone. Liam was broken. Carlos had been reduced to a man clinging to survival, and Darius was no longer at their mercy. He was the one holding the rope. The sharp scent of gunpowder still hung in the warehouse air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood seeping into the cracked concrete. Slim Reed's body slumped against the workbench, his lifeless eyes staring into nothing, his blood slowly pooling beneath the scattered stacks of cash. The echo of the gunshot had faded, but the tension had not. Carlos Reyes stood over the corpse, his pistol still clutched in his trembling hand, his breathing shallow and erratic. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, replaced by the gnawing realization that there was no return from this. He had crossed the line he had been trying to avoid. He had killed one of his own. Liam Brooks remained huddled near the door, clutching his wounded leg, his face pale and his breath shaky. His eyes darted between the corpse, Carlos, and Darius Cole, as though trying to predict which man would pull the trigger next. Darius rose slowly from his seated position against the wall, his hands still bound, but his posture no longer that of a hostage. He stepped carefully, his gaze fixed on Carlos, watching the man unravel before him. Carlos's composure, the leader who had walked into the bank with such confidence, was gone. In his place stood a man whose future had been reduced to mere minutes. The faint sound of police vehicles shifting outside cut through the thick silence. The authorities were closing in. Carlos heard it too. His eyes twitched toward the door, his fingers flexing around his pistol. His mind was spinning. Darius could see it. The calculation, the desperation, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. Without warning, Carlos snapped his pistol toward Darius, his voice cracking with tension. "We're not done!" Back against the wall. Darius froze, not out of fear, but strategy. He had anticipated this. The final grasp of a drowning man. "Don't," Darius said firmly, his tone stripped of emotion, designed to cut through panic. "There's no getting out of this now. You shoot me, you die 10 seconds later." But Carlos's hand shook. Not from weakness, but from resolve, born of a man with nothing left to lose. Darius acted. He lunged forward, his bound hand sweeping upward to strike Carlos's gun arm. The pistol jerked to the side as Darius drove his shoulder into Carlos's chest, forcing him backward. They collided into the workbench, knocking aside the blood-soaked cash. Carlos grunted, his free hand swinging for Darius's ribs, but Darius twisted, absorbing the blow with the side of his body. Using his momentum, Darius shifted his weight, hooking his foot behind Carlos's leg, sweeping him off balance. They crashed to the ground, Carlos's gun skittering across the concrete floor. Carlos thrashed beneath Darius, his fists pounding against his chest and ribs, but Darius endured it. Years of combat training reducing the blows to mere noise. He pressed his knee into Carlos's chest, pinning him, his zip-tied hands clamping down on Carlos's wrist, grinding it into the floor. "Stop!" Liam's voice cracked, hoarse and desperate. "Stop! Please!" For a moment, Darius thought he was pleading for mercy for Carlos, but when he turned his head, he saw Liam crawling toward the discarded pistol. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing the grip. Darius tensed, ready to throw himself toward the weapon, until Liam snatched it up and turned it toward Carlos. "Let him go!" Liam's voice shook, but his eyes were resolute, his aim firm. "Carlos, it's over. You know it. You don't have to die here." Carlos thrashed once more beneath Darius, but his strength was waning. "I'll kill you," Carlos spat through clenched teeth, his voice laced with exhaustion and hate. "Both of you. You think this ends with me?" Darius pressed his knee harder into Carlos's chest, cutting off his breath. "It ends when you stop," Darius growled, his tone low and final. "Your men are dead. Your cartel connection is silent. You're not getting out of here. You know it. You feel it." For the first time, Carlos's eyes revealed what was underneath the rage. Fear. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. Voices. Orders being called. Police moving into position after hearing the gunfire. The walls were closing in. Carlos's body sagged beneath Darius. The fight was gone. "Don't shoot!" Darius called out loudly toward the entrance, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're done!" "He's down." The door burst open, officers flooding in, their weapons raised. Sergeant Michelle Tanner's voice rang out over the commotion. "Hands where we can see them!" Darius raised his bound hands slowly, stepping back from Carlos. Liam dropped the pistol immediately, his hands shaking as he raised them above his head. Carlos lay still, chest heaving, his eyes glassy, defeated. The officers moved swiftly. Carlos was pinned, cuffed, and hauled to his feet, his face blank as the reality of his failure fully set in. Liam offered no resistance, his head lowered, his face pale with relief and shame. Darius stood tall as an officer, cut the zip ties from his wrists. He flexed his fingers, the ache from his captivity fading beneath the rush of freedom. "You all right?" Sergeant Tanner approached, concern laced in her voice. Darius met her gaze, his face calm, but his eyes tired. Yeah, it's over. The officers secured the cash, bagging it alongside Slim's lifeless body. Liam was treated gently, his injury addressed as he was led to another vehicle. He asked about his child. Officers assured him arrangements would be made. Climax: emotional and surprising resolutions. 800 words. Carlos falls. Darius stands tall. The crowd had begun to thin as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel lot outside the warehouse. The flashing lights of the patrol cars still painted the ground in bursts of red and blue, but the frenzy was settling. The violence was over, but its echo clung to the air. Darius Cole stood near the edge of the scene, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his body aching from the hours of tension, the blows he had taken, and the weight of holding everything together when it had threatened to collapse. But he was standing. He had won. Carlos Reyes was not. Darius turned as he heard the scuff of boots against stone. Carlos was being led from the warehouse by two officers, his wrists cuffed behind his back, his face twisted into something that was part anger, part humiliation. Blood splattered his shirt from Slim's death, and his eyes burned with the knowledge that everything, his plan, his future, his reputation, was gone. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Carlos leaned forward slightly, his voice low but dripping with venom as the officers paused beside the squad car. "This ain't over, Cole. You think you ruined me? You just delayed it. The cartel, they don't forget. You hear me? They don't forget. You'll wish you died in that bank." Darius didn't blink. He let Carlos's words hang there, sour and bitter, before stepping forward. He closed the distance between them, not enough to threaten, but enough that every word he spoke would cut through the noise and bury itself in Carlos's chest like a knife. "You're wrong," Darius said, his voice low but firm. There was no anger, no bravado, just the weight of truth. "It is over. For you." Carlos's eyes flared, but Darius pressed on. "You walked into this town thinking you owned it, thinking fear was enough to make you untouchable. But you made the mistake every coward makes. You thought a gun in your hand made you strong. You thought blood bought loyalty. You thought people like Slim were your shield." Darius leaned in slightly, his tone sharpening like steel. "But all you did was surround yourself with weakness. Men who feared you more than they respected you. And when the pressure came, they folded. And now you have nothing." Carlos's jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched beneath his skin, but he said nothing. Darius straightened, his voice growing colder. "The cartel? You're right. They don't forget. But you're not their man anymore. You're a liability. You're the fool who got caught. And if you think they'll lift a finger to save you from a prison cell, you don't know them like you think you do. You're not their investment now. You're their example." Carlos's breathing quickened, his eyes darting between Darius and the officers flanking him. For the first time, Darius saw it. The shift, the bravado cracked, the fear took root. Carlos wasn't worried about the police anymore. He was thinking about what came next. Who would be waiting when the bars closed behind him? Before Carlos could respond, the officers nudged him toward the open car door. "Time's up," one of them muttered. Carlos hesitated for half a second, his mouth twitching as if he wanted to spit one last threat. But nothing came. His eyes lingered on Darius, not with defiance, but with the realization that he had already lost. Then he ducked into the back seat, and the door slammed shut. The patrol car rolled forward slowly, kicking up gravel as it merged onto the road leading back into town. Darius watched it disappear into the horizon. Carlos was gone. A subtle weight lifted from his chest. He turned back toward the remaining officers, his gaze catching Sergeant Michelle Tanner. She had been watching the exchange from a distance, arms folded, her expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, she gave him the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had finished what needed to be done. Darius scanned the scene one last time. Liam Brooks had already been taken to receive medical attention. He had surrendered without resistance, his face pale but relieved. He would face justice, but there was no fight left in him. His future would be decided in courtrooms, not warehouses. The money was secured. The cash Slim had bled over was now sealed in evidence bags, proof of the crime, but also a reminder of the cost. The crowd had faded into whispers and distant stares. The townspeople who had gathered knew what he had done for them, but their admiration was laced with something else now. Respect, yes, but also caution. Darius took a slow breath. He had seen it before, in small villages overseas, after his team had cleared a threat. The people cheered the soldiers, but also feared what men like him were capable of. He was no longer just Darius Cole, the bank owner. He was Darius Cole, the man who killed to protect his town. That was a name he would carry now, both an honor and a burden. But he was ready. He had been ready his whole life. As he stepped away from the scene, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones, he heard Tanner's voice behind him. Quieter this time. You did good, Cole. Whatever comes next, you earned this one. Darius glanced back over his shoulder. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need applause. He just needed to know he had done the right thing, and he had. The warehouse emptied slowly, but Darius lingered for a moment, his eyes on the stained floor, the echoes of violence still fresh. This was not his first battlefield, but it was one of the few where he had fought alone. He had survived, but more importantly, he had won. He stepped outside, the fresh air filling his lungs as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. This was his town, and no one would take it from him. The metallic creak of the warehouse door closing behind him felt like a barrier between two worlds. Inside had been violence, death, and survival. Outside was sunlight, fresh air, and life moving forward, but not unchanged. Darius Cole stepped onto the gravel lot, his shirt dark with sweat and smeared with blood that wasn't his own. His ribs ached with every breath, and his wrists stung where the zip ties had cut into his skin. But none of it mattered. He was breathing. He was free. Sergeant Michelle Tanner walked beside him, her eyes flicking over the perimeter as her officers secured the scene. She had asked if he was all right back inside, her voice laced with concern, respect, and caution all at once. But out here, her professional mask had slipped back into place. She was back in command, and this was still her scene. Crowds gathering, she muttered, nodding toward the cluster of townspeople forming just beyond the police tape. Word travels fast. Darius glanced over. The faces were familiar. People he had seen at the bank every week, neighbors who waved from porches, parents who brought their kids to open savings accounts. Mrs. Henderson stood near the front, clutching her knitting bag like it was a shield. Tom and Rachel were there too, holding hands tightly as though they still feared being ripped apart. Young Ben, the teenager from the bank, hovered behind them, eyes wide with the kind of reverence usually reserved for comic book heroes. Darius exhaled slowly. He had protected these people, but now they were looking at him like he was someone else. "You're about to be the biggest story this town's had in a decade," Tanner said, her tone quieter now. "Probably more than that." Darius nodded faintly, but his eyes remained on the crowd. He saw admiration, gratitude, but there was something else behind it, a cautious curiosity. They had known him as the quiet bank owner. Now, they saw something different. "Some are already calling you a hero," Tanner continued, her voice steady, but edged with the weight of reality. "But not everyone's going to see it that way. Once the shock fades, questions will come. Lawyers, investigators, civilians who've never had a gun pointed at their head will start asking why you moved like you did. Why didn't you just wait for us to handle it?" Darius's jaw tightened, though he kept his face neutral. He had seen this before, after missions overseas, after operations where his team had done what was necessary, only to face scrutiny from people who had never set foot on a battlefield. The rules were always clear. until you were the one with seconds to decide between life and death. Then, the rules bent or broke. I'll handle it, Darius said, his voice low, steady. Tanner studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. I know you will, but you should be ready. Small towns love heroes. Until they get too close. She stepped away to direct 2 officers toward the rear perimeter, leaving Darius alone with the weight of her words. He squared his shoulders, pushing aside the fatigue that gnawed at his limbs. There was one more battle to face. The people he had saved. As he walked toward the crowd, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward first, her eyes damp but shining with warmth. Darius, thank you. You were brave. I thought we were all going to die. Her voice cracked, and she gripped his hand with both of hers, frail but firm. Darius gave a gentle squeeze, his voice soft. You're safe now. That's what matters. Tom and Rachel approached next. You got us home, Tom said, his throat tight. You stood between us and those men. I'll never forget that. Rachel wiped her eyes, nodding. We owe you everything. Darius accepted their gratitude with a quiet nod, but he could feel the eyes from deeper in the crowd, the weight of their questions pressing against their awe. The quiet banker was no longer just a banker. He was something more, something dangerous. Darius's chest tightened. He had left that life behind, or so he thought. Ben, the teenager, stepped closer. His voice wavered with awe, but there was innocence in it. You saved us. Like a soldier, like the movies. Darius knelt slightly so their eyes met. He saw his younger self in the boy, the same look he had worn when he had admired men who seemed invincible. I'm not a hero, Darius said quietly. I'm just someone who wanted to make sure you got home. The crowd had begun to thin as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel lot outside the warehouse. The flashing lights of the patrol cars still painted the ground in bursts of red and blue, but the frenzy was settling. The violence was over, but its echo clung to the air. Darius Cole stood near the edge of the scene, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his body aching from the hours of tension, the blows he had taken, and the weight of holding everything together when it had threatened to collapse. But he was standing. He had won. Carlos Reyes was not. Darius turned as he heard the scuff of boots against stone. Carlos was being led from the warehouse by 2 officers, his wrists cuffed behind his back, his face twisted into something that was part anger, part humiliation. Blood splattered his shirt from Slim's death, and his eyes burned with the knowledge that everything, his plan, his future, his reputation, was gone. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Carlos leaned forward slightly, his voice low but dripping with venom as the officers paused beside the squad car. This ain't over, Cole. You think you ruined me? You just delayed it. The cartel, they don't forget. You hear me? They don't forget. You'll wish you died in that bank. Darius didn't blink. He let Carlos's words hang there, sour and bitter, before stepping forward. He closed the distance between them, not enough to threaten, but enough that every word he spoke would cut through the noise and bury itself in Carlos's chest like a knife. You're wrong, Darius said, his voice low but firm. There was no anger, no bravado, just the weight of truth. It is over. For you. Carlos's eyes flared, but Darius pressed on. You walked into this town thinking you owned it, thinking fear was enough to make you untouchable. But you made the mistake every coward makes. You thought a gun in your hand made you strong. You thought blood bought loyalty. You thought people like Slim were your shield. Darius leaned in slightly, his tone sharpening like steel. But all you did was surround yourself with weakness. Men who feared you more than they respected you. And when the pressure came, they folded. And now you have nothing. Carlos's jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched beneath his skin, but he said nothing. Darius straightened, his voice growing colder. The cartel? You're right. They don't forget. But you're not their man anymore. You're a liability. You're the fool who got caught. And if you think they'll lift a finger to save you from a prison cell, You don't know them like you think you do. You're not their investment now. You're their example." Carlos's breathing quickened, his eyes darting between Darius and the officers flanking him. For the first time, Darius saw it. The shift, the bravado cracked, the fear took root. Carlos wasn't worried about the police anymore. He was thinking about what came next. Who would be waiting when the bars closed behind him? Before Carlos could respond, the officers nudged him toward the open car door. "Time's up," one of them muttered. Carlos hesitated for half a second, his mouth twitching as if he wanted to spit one last threat. But nothing came. His eyes lingered on Darius, not with defiance, but with the realization that he had already lost. Then he ducked into the back seat, and the door slammed shut. The patrol car rolled forward slowly, kicking up gravel as it merged onto the road leading back into town. Darius watched it disappear into the horizon. Carlos was gone. A subtle weight lifted from his chest. He turned back toward the remaining officers, his gaze catching Sergeant Michelle Tanner. She had been watching the exchange from a distance, arms folded, her expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, she gave him the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had finished what needed to be done. Darius scanned the scene one last time. Liam Brooks had already been taken to receive medical attention. He had surrendered without resistance, his face pale but relieved. He would face justice, but there was no fight left in him. His future would be decided in courtrooms, not warehouses. The money was secured. The cash Slim had bled over was now sealed in evidence bags, proof of the crime, but also a reminder of the cost. The crowd had faded into whispers and distant stares. The townspeople who had gathered knew what he had done for them, but their admiration was laced with something else now. Respect, yes, but also caution. Darius took a slow breath. He had seen it before. In small villages overseas, after his team had cleared a threat, the people cheered the soldiers, but also feared what men like him were capable of. As he stepped away from the scene, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones, he heard Tanner's voice behind him, quieter this time. "You did good, Cole. Whatever comes next, you earned this one." Darius glanced back over his shoulder. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need applause. He just needed to know he had done the right thing, and he had. A week later, the glass doors of Cole Security Bank gleamed under the morning sun. Newly replaced after the destruction from the robbery, the interior, once marked by fear and violence, had been scrubbed clean. Fresh paint covered scuff marks, new security cameras perched discreetly in corners, and reinforced bullet-resistant glass framed the teller's windows. The lobby smelled of fresh polish, but for Darius Cole, the scars from that day lingered beneath the surface, invisible to others, but carved into his memory. He stood near the entrance, adjusting the final keypad settings for the upgraded security system. The soft beep as he armed it echoed through the quiet bank, a sound of control and protection. He had spared no expense. New alarm sensors, reinforced back doors, and a panic button at every station. The bank was no longer just a place of business. It was a fortress. He would ensure that no one would ever threaten his people like that again. Sophie, his branch manager, passed by carrying a small box of office supplies. She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to his side. "It's looking good, Mr. Cole," she said, though there was a slight hesitance in her voice. She had been here that day, on the floor, terrified. That fear didn't wash away with paint and new glass. Darius offered a small nod. "We'll be better prepared next time." "But there won't be a next time." She gave a faint smile, but he knew trust was something that would need time to fully rebuild. It was the same with everyone. The customers had started to return, but their gazes lingered on him longer now. Curious, cautious, perhaps grateful, but different. He was not just a businessman anymore. He was the man who had faced death and fought back. That was respect, but also distance. Later that afternoon, as he locked up the main doors, he noticed a familiar figure leaning against a patrol car parked across the street. Sergeant Michelle Tanner. She wore her uniform casually, arms crossed, observing the bank with her usual measured gaze. He crossed the street, the sun casting their shadows together over the asphalt. "Checking up on me, Sergeant?" Darius said, his tone light but knowing. Tanner smirked faintly, though her eyes were serious. "Part of the job, but mostly, I wanted to see how you're holding up." Darius exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the bank. "Getting there. Stronger than before. That's the only way forward." Tanner nodded approvingly, though there was more behind her look. She shifted slightly, lowering her voice. "We cleared more on Carlos. He wasn't lying about the cartel. Small time here, but his debts were deep. With him locked up, we've got eyes on any possible retaliation. But if they decide this town is still valuable," she let the words hang, knowing Darius would understand. Darius's eyes hardened slightly, his mind already moving toward the possibility. "If they come," he said, his tone calm but final. "I'll be ready." Tanner studied him for a moment, as though weighing his response, not doubting his ability, but measuring just how far he was willing to go. She had seen the sharpness in him during the hostage rescue. He was more than a civilian, and she knew it. "You ever think about putting those skills back to use?" Tanner asked, almost casually, though the offer beneath it was clear. "Off the books, when the town needs it. Not every problem fits into a police manual." Darius met her gaze, reading between the lines. She wasn't offering a badge, she was offering something quieter. A phone call when trouble came that needed someone who didn't freeze under fire, someone who could act when others hesitated. For a brief moment, he thought about his time as a Navy SEAL. The clarity of action, the weight of responsibility, the camaraderie that came with knowing lives depended on you. That part of him had never really left. But this was his town, his home. He had built a life here. His war wasn't overseas anymore. It was right here, protecting these people, this place. He nodded, slow and deliberate. "If you ever need me, you know where to find me." Tanner extended her hand. He shook it firmly. "Good," she said, her eyes holding a flicker of respect, "because the world's not getting any quieter." As she drove off, Darius stood alone for a moment, watching the sun set over the town he had nearly died defending. The streets were quiet again. Families moved about their business. Children laughed in the distance. It was peace, but he understood now. It was a peace that had to be guarded. He adjusted his collar, the faint ache in his ribs reminding him of the cost. But it was a price he had been willing to pay. He would pay it again if he had to, because this was his home, and no one would take it from him. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.